Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and today I'm going to be attempting to answer this question. Should we be worried about Nintendo Switch 2 now? And this question is being posed in this way because we did just get some new reports about sales for Switch 2 over the holidays, and some people are going to take this information and try and spin it into that the Switch 2 finally has become a massive flop. Spoiler, that's not actually the case, but it is perhaps a warning sign that the Switch 2 is not doing as well as we would have liked or as some people would hope. And this conversation also bleeds into just Nintendo's overall lineup that we've gotten and what we're expected to get. There are rumors suggesting that this year of Switch 2 might be kind of light, which might be concerning to a lot of people. And so I think this latest information certainly prompts the question, should we be worried about Nintendo Switch 2 now? Will Switch 2 continue to suffer sales-wise? Is Switch 2 starting to trend in a negative direction from a sales perspective? And what does this mean for the games? Are we going to get the big games, and has Nintendo been holding back, or is it actually the case that Nintendo has not been holding back, and, well, we're looking at a pretty light lineup? That's what I want to dive further into today. Now, a couple quick things I want to point out here. I do have this goal to reach 60,000 subscribers, so if you find yourself enjoying my videos, you subscribing would be very much appreciated if you haven't done so already. And also, this video is going to be a little bit more lightly edited, or a lot more lightly edited. I am on a time crunch today, but I did want to talk about this. This news did just come out, and so here are my thoughts on the overall situation. So, the game business just reported that Switch 2 in the months of November and December in the US was down by around 35% compared to Switch 1 in that same period back in 2017. And they also reported that in the UK, Switch 2 sales in the last 8 weeks of the year were 16% lower than Switch 1 during that same period back in 2017. However, they also note that if you account for Switch 1 sales now, in the UK, sales overall were 7% higher, which I find an interesting thing to point out because you're not maybe accounting for the 3DS back in 2017, which also sold a few million. And then they also talk about how in France during this period, it was over 30% lower than Switch 1 from the first year during that same period. And then it's also talked about how in Japan, based off the Famitsu data, it's not as bad, but Switch 2 did sell slightly worse, 5.5% worse over the same period. Well, technically this comparison is including the last 9 weeks, not the last 8 weeks, but it's close. And so the overall indication here is that in those last couple months of the year, Switch 2 has sold worse than Switch 1 in its first holiday season, November and December from 2017. And so people are now looking at this information, and there are certainly people out there spinning this into being some sort of incredible negative. The Switch 2 is finally going to be a massive, massive flop. But there's several things to consider here. One, we do not have the overall picture. We're not getting exact, objective, solid numbers from every region. We're just getting some percent comparisons for some regions, some major regions, which will certainly impact things, and I do think it's still overall suggestive that Switch 2 has had a worse first November and December than Switch 1. Main point is we do not have the full picture, and the full picture may suggest something slightly different here. But also we should take into consideration that there is the overall economic climate that we're going through right now. People don't have as much spending money. Technology has been getting more expensive across the board. This is not just a Nintendo thing. Things are just getting more expensive. This year, we saw price increases for different popular game consoles, which at least based off recent history is unprecedented, and that just goes to show the overall economic climate right now. So things are getting more expensive, people are not getting pay raises right now, so it would make sense to think that people don't have as much spending money on luxury items like video game consoles. And yet, there are still other factors to consider here. Switch 2 is still in a really good position. Last time we had a conversation about this, we were talking about how Switch 2 is still pacing to be the best-selling console of all time. And while finally Switch 2 has maybe lost some ground in terms of pace, they may still be pacing. Again, we don't have the exact numbers here, but looking at this chart from VGC, we see the first couple quarters of Switch 2 in comparison to the first couple quarters of Switch 1, and Switch 2 was very much ahead of pace compared to Switch 1, and then when we account for an extra quarter of Switch 1, Switch 2 is still well ahead of that with just the couple quarters there. Now, once we account for a whole year of Switch 1 sales, that would be ahead of what's already been officially reported from the first 2 quarters of Switch 2, but there's still all this room for Switch 2 to build on that and keep its lead. So this takes me back to my point about us not having the full picture here. Reminder that friend of the channel Paul Gale, who has access to sales data, has reported that as of December 5th, Switch 2 has sold 15 million, which is interesting because as of December 5th, Nintendo's already hit their initial forecast for sales of Switch 2 in its first fiscal year. By December 5th, when we still have the rest of December, January, February, and all of March to hit that target. Now, Nintendo has updated that forecast after seeing strong sales and getting a better understanding of how they're going to be able to meet demand to 19 million, but with essentially a little bit under 4 months to spare, as long as they're selling a little bit over 1 million per month, which they likely have been, they're going to hit that target. And something else I think is interesting, when we take a look at the first holiday quarter of Switch 1 sales in 2017, which this data also includes for October, so this is a little bit bigger, they still sold an extraordinary amount during that period of time. So to sell, let's say 30 to 35% worse than this, would still probably be pretty good. This is where that quote, "comparison is a thief of joy" comes to mind here. Switch 2 might still be doing really good, but because technically Switch 1 had a really good sales period, some people are going to compare the sales number to Switch 2 and argue that it's been pretty bad. But that's only by comparison to Switch 1 that had an extraordinary sales period. This would be ignoring all the other periods where Switch 2 has outperformed Switch 1. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that Nintendo has done a much better job of meeting demand this time around. When Switch 1 came out in that first year, it was far more difficult to keep up with the demand, because Nintendo was not able to put out enough supply. Nintendo's done a much better job of putting out enough supply. And so we just don't have a full understanding of what this is going to mean long term. Are sales worse this holiday period just because of the economic climate? Are sales worse this holiday period just because Nintendo's been able to meet demand throughout the year a lot better, as opposed to Switch 1, where they were only able to finally start meeting demand for the holiday? So anyone jumping to the conclusion that Switch 2 has now all of a sudden become a massive flop based off this report that does not have a full picture, well, probably isn't accurate is my main point here. And it's definitely drawing a conclusion without enough information. But let's say this is indeed a first sign that Switch 2 is not going to maintain its pace of being the best-selling console of all time. It is going to come back to earth, and it's going to eventually fall behind the pace of Switch 1 sales. That may very well happen. Very few people before Switch 2 came out were predicting that Switch 2 was going to sell better than Switch 1, but I also don't think Switch 2 has to sell better than Switch 1. But if it's comparable, that's an incredible success. So to be off to this hot of a start overall, still a good thing. But how far behind might Switch 2 fall? That we honestly don't know. Some people might argue, though, that it could become a lot. Because prices are only continuing to increase in terms of technology, the Switch 2 might get a price raise in its second year. I hope that doesn't happen, but given that a whole bunch of other consoles have increased their prices, it's not out of the question. And some people might also argue that the first 6 months of Switch 2 haven't been the best possible lineup of games. And I don't agree that it's a bad lineup. I think it is actually a pretty good lineup. But do I think Nintendo has had a Breath of the Wild or Mario Odyssey kind of game already? And personally, I don't think they have. I think Donkey Kong Bonanza is amazing. I think Mario Kart World is amazing. But I don't think these games are on the level of a Mario Odyssey or a Breath of the Wild. Now, Mario Kart World actually may end up selling better than all these games. But in terms of having that game that really draws in that core audience early on, I don't think Donkey Kong Bonanza and Mario Kart World are as heavy of hitters as Breath of the Wild and Mario Odyssey, games Nintendo had for Switch 1 in its first year. But I also think it's fair to acknowledge that Nintendo didn't really need to have games like that in the first 6 months. I think the lineup they had was good. Metroid Prime 4, Pokemon Legends ZA, Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment, Mario Galaxy 1+2, and then Donkey Kong Bonanza and Mario Kart World. Oh, and also Kirby Air Riders. That's not a bad lineup of first-party games in the first 6 months, and I'm not even counting all the little things, or the third-party support. Really, the bigger question is, how is Nintendo going to follow this up? Will Nintendo put out a lineup and support the Switch 2 in a way that will lead itself towards continuing to fall behind pace, or will they find a way to maintain pace or even build on this pace? There are rumors coming from a few different people that I would consider to be reliable that this year is going to be very port heavy. And from one end, that's actually a very good thing because it's suggestive of a lot of big third-party support on the way, and for the masses this might be a big deal. Seeing games like Monster Hunter Wilds or perhaps Grand Theft Auto. I don't think Grand Theft Auto 6 is coming out for Switch 2 this year, maybe a year or two later. But just the idea of a lot of big third-party games becoming available on Switch 2 and running well, as we've seen with other games like Cyberpunk, Star Wars Outlaws, Final Fantasy VII Remake, hopefully Elden Ring is running well once it finally comes out. Those types of releases will certainly make a big positive difference. We're seeing stronger third-party support for Switch 2 than we saw for Switch 1. Like, from that perspective, the Switch 2 is doing extremely well. And maybe that has something to do with why Nintendo hasn't showed perhaps all their cards yet, because they are aware they have a stronger lineup of third-party games. But you know, there's another reason why some of these analysts have suggested why the Switch 2 did not do as well during this period of time, November, December, than compared to Switch 1's first November, December. And that's because there isn't a game like Mario Odyssey or Breath of the Wild yet. We don't have a new 3D Zelda. We don't have a new 3D Mario. And if we're to believe these rumors, a lot of these people aren't so sure we're going to be getting a 3D Zelda or a 3D Mario this year. And so I think there are two big considerations here. One, maybe we are still going to get a 3D Mario or 3D Zelda this year, and some of these people who think that just aren't fully informed on the overall situation, or they're not, and Nintendo's going to have to find a way to replace that. Can they put something out there that will replace that will still be pretty good and help them to maintain momentum and keep getting people to pick up the console despite these challenging economic times? I would like to point out we heard from Andy Robinson after the release for The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom back in 2023, that Nintendo would not have another major game until the release of Metroid Prime 4, which I found interesting that they consider Metroid Prime 4 to be a major release. But after Tears of the Kingdom, we got games like Pikmin 4 and Super Mario Bros. Wonder. Now, 2024 was kind of a slow year. There were some highlights like The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom and the Paper Mario Thousand Year Door remake, but yeah, it was a pretty weak year. But it was a pretty weak year because we got Switch 2 in 2025. And in 2025, while the first half was definitely extremely light, Nintendo only had 2 published titles come out before Switch 2 released in June. But once that came around, we got Mario Kart World, Donkey Kong Bonanza, Pokemon Legends ZA, and then Metroid Prime 4 came out in December. So there was a lot of major games we actually got from Nintendo between Tears of the Kingdom and Metroid Prime 4. So I would say what we heard from insiders at the time that things might be light. By the way, it wasn't just Andy Robinson. He's just the first person that comes to mind. He was backed by others that this information was circulating. Then maybe we shouldn't jump to the conclusion that there's going to be absolutely nothing here. Listen, on this channel, I talk about rumors, I talk about leaks, but I try to talk about them when there's some reason to think that there's credibility there. But some reason to think there's credibility does not mean that they have a 100% track record, just a record with some level of reliability, so there's reason to have that conversation and we can consider the likelihood. And so what that means is, whatever we're hearing, I don't think is a 100% guarantee of what is going to happen. As I talked about earlier this week, I put out a video talking about how I'm convinced that there needs to be at least a 3D Mario or a 3D Zelda of some kind to come out this year, because I do think Nintendo needs to put out something major like this to keep the momentum going. There is a reason why, if you look at things from a historical perspective, they've never gone 2 holidays without having at least a 3D Zelda or a 3D Mario available on the console. That's because it helps them to have strong sales to start. So not putting out either by the end of 2026, I think would definitely be a mistake by Nintendo. Now, you might argue that maybe they're trying to weather the storm here and they're saving these big releases because they acknowledge that sales are just not going to be as strong right now, and so they're just sitting on them until the right time comes once the economic climate turns around. I don't think that's what's happening because there's no telling when this will turn around. I think you have to maximize the sales you're going to get, plus they've already waited so long to put out Switch 2, and they already put out games like Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza. I don't think they're holding back because they're waiting for a better sales period. If you wait too long, then you kind of just shoot yourself in the foot. Like, 3DS probably could have been a better success, or even the Wii U could have been a better success if they had a stronger lineup to come out earlier on, and they didn't, and so those consoles suffered quite a bit. You have to continue with a strong, consistent lineup all throughout. I don't think Nintendo is intentionally holding back their biggest, best releases because they're worried about sales being a little bit down because of the economic climate. Sales were actually up quite a bit until they didn't have a 3D Mario or a 3D Zelda for the holiday. But I go through all my arguments why a 3D Zelda of some kind or a 3D Mario makes a lot of sense for 2026 in that video I put out a couple days ago. So if you want to check out those arguments, you can check out that video. Let's entertain the possibility that we don't get these. Should we be worried about what's to come this year? Can Nintendo put out a lineup that would still be satisfactory without these kinds of games for this first proper calendar year and that second holiday of Switch 2? Well, we have reason to believe that maybe we could get something like a Luigi's Mansion 4, perhaps the next Monolith Soft title, and I think these games could be pretty amazing. They could be games that would certainly satisfy me. We have the exclusive The Dust Bloods on the way as well. Generation 10 of Pokemon actually might be an incredibly huge deal. Like, if they just come out with a good Pokemon game, I'm not talking about a masterpiece, but a good Pokemon game that is far more polished than what we got for Scarlet and Violet for that first new generation on Switch 2, that could be enormous. And an interesting possibility here, from what we've heard of the Terra leak, there was a plan that Generation 10 Pokemon is going to be exclusive for Switch 2. It will not be on Switch 1. Which feels like a little bit early to jump onto the whole exclusivity train, but that would contribute to the game probably looking and running better, being a bit more ambitious, which would probably excite more people about the game, and hopefully also lead it towards it being a more polished experience. But then if it is exclusive, also accounting for that little bit extra amount of excitement for it being Generation 10 and it hopefully running well, we might just be underestimating just how big of a draw that could really be. Pokemon just sells ridiculous numbers here, and that kind of release could really change the trajectory of things here. But then there's another element to consider that is actually going back to the Mario Zelda element that I didn't mention. But we do have the Mario movie coming out this year, and we do have the Zelda movie coming out next year. I've talked about this before, but Nintendo may have a master plan here, as they saw with the Mario movie in 2023. When that Mario movie came out, Mario sales across the board increased to a significant degree. That may very well happen again with this next Mario movie, which will certainly in turn impact sales overall for Nintendo and the Switch 2, and there's plenty of reason to think that that will also apply for the Zelda movie when that comes out next year as well. And the marketing for that Zelda movie will likely begin towards the end of this year, where we might start to see some of those impacts from a sales perspective. Which, by the way, would be more reason for Nintendo to put out different Mario Universe and Zelda Universe releases in this year, even if it's not the next big 3D Mario or the next big 3D Zelda remake. So, movie sales boosting overall Nintendo sales, which would lead to better software sales and perhaps hardware sales, that's gonna help. And then an exclusive Generation 10 Pokemon and hopefully some other big quality titles like the Dust Bloods, like Luigi's Mansion 4, like whatever's next from Monolith Soft. Even if there isn't a big Zelda or Mario title this year, which I think there's reason to think we'll still get something like that, or at least they'll be announced to be coming out in 2027, there's plenty of reason to think that Switch 2 is going to be just fine, and perhaps even still somehow find a way to continue its pace of being the best-selling console of all time. It's up for debate, and it doesn't even have to hit that. There's a lot of wiggle room here. I don't think most of us really care that much if Switch 2 becomes the best-selling console of all time. We just want good games to come and for it to be relatively successful so this continues. And from that perspective, we have so much wiggle room, I don't think there's really any reason at all to be worried. Honestly, I think most of the worry just comes from people who are doom-mongering or grifting for clicks, because hate unfortunately sells a lot more than anything else in this current climate of the world. But actually considering the overall situation, I don't think we should be worried. Now, one concern might be of us just not getting a big Mario or Zelda this year, but I got a feeling Nintendo probably has something cooking up, and it's probably not going to be as bad as some might suggest. It's probably still going to be pretty good. But what do you all think? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I will see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.